Sometimes the most powerful people in the room are the ones you least expect. Sometimes the person standing quietly in the corner, listening to every cruel word and dismissive laugh, holds more authority than anyone could imagine. Sometimes the universe has a way of serving justice so perfectly, so completely, that it leaves an entire room speechless. This is the story of Commander Sarah Mitchell, a woman who walked into a room full of arrogant assumptions and walked out having delivered one of the most legendary reality checks in military history. It's about the moment when prejudice met its match, when underestimation collided with unshakable competence, and when a group of people learned that respect isn't given based on appearance, it's earned through action, and sometimes it's demanded through consequence. What happens when someone who has fought in the world's most dangerous places, who has led the most elite soldiers through impossible missions, who has earned every stripe and star through blood, sweat, and unwavering dedication, is treated like she doesn't belong? What happens when that person has had enough of being invisible, enough of being dismissed, enough of watching mediocrity mock excellence? You're about to find out. Because this isn't just a story about military rank or gender dynamics. This is a story about the moment when quiet strength speaks volumes, when true leadership shows itself, and when the people who thought they knew better learned they knew nothing at all. The fluorescent lights in Conference Room C buzzed with that particular frequency that seemed designed to make everyone slightly irritable. Commander Sarah Mitchell sat in a back corner, her hands folded quietly in her lap, watching the room fill with naval officers, contractors, and Pentagon officials. She had arrived 15 minutes early, as was her habit, and had chosen the seat that gave her the best view of both the entrance and the presentation screen. She wore her dress blues, every ribbon and insignia perfectly placed. But somehow, most of the people filing into the room seemed to look right through her. The few who noticed her at all offered polite nods, the kind reserved for someone they assumed was probably someone's aide, or perhaps a junior intelligence officer there to take notes. Sarah had grown accustomed to this invisibility over her 15-year career. At 5'4", with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and a face that people often described as pleasant, she didn't fit the mental image most people carried of a Navy SEAL commander. She didn't look like the recruitment posters or the action movie heroes. She looked like someone's sister, someone's daughter, someone who might work in accounting or human resources. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent the last 3 years commanding SEAL Team 7, one of the most elite special operations units in the world. Her teams had conducted 47 successful missions across 3 continents. She had been awarded the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Combat V, and the Navy Cross. Her tactical innovations had been incorporated into SEAL training programs worldwide. But in rooms like this, away from the battlefield, away from the respect her uniform commanded in operational environments, she became invisible again. The meeting was supposed to start at 1400 hours, but it was now 1410, and people were still filing in, greeting each other with hearty handshakes and backslapping familiarity. Sarah recognized most of the faces. Admiral Thompson, a career bureaucrat who hadn't seen combat since his brief deployment to the Persian Gulf in the early 90s. Captain Rodriguez, who ran logistics for the East Coast SEAL teams but had never actually been a SEAL himself. Commander Briggs, whose main claim to fame was being the nephew of a former Secretary of Defense. They clustered in small groups, their voices carrying across the room with the particular confidence of men who had never doubted their place in the world. Sarah listened to their conversations drift from last weekend's golf games to speculation about upcoming promotions to complaints about their wives' spending habits. Occasionally, someone would glance in her direction, but their eyes would slide away quickly, dismissively. "Gentlemen, let's get started," Admiral Thompson called out, taking his position at the head of the conference table. The room gradually settled, chairs scraping against linoleum as the 23 people in attendance found their seats. Sarah remained in her corner chair, notepad ready, expression neutral. "Before we begin," Admiral Thompson continued, "I want to remind everyone that today's briefing on the Somalia operation is classified at the highest levels. Nothing discussed in this room leaves this room." His eyes swept the assembled group, pausing briefly on Sarah with a slight frown, as if trying to remember who she was or why she was there. The briefing began with a PowerPoint presentation delivered by Captain Rodriguez. The slide showed satellite imagery, operational timelines, and casualty reports from a recent SEAL operation that had gone sideways. 3 SEALs had been wounded, the primary objective had not been achieved, and the team had been forced to call for emergency extraction. "As you can see," Captain Rodriguez said, clicking to the next slide, The mission parameters were clearly defined, but execution fell short of expectations. We're here to conduct a post-action review and determine what went wrong. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She knew exactly what had gone wrong, because it had been her team, her planning, and her decision-making that had saved those 3 wounded SEALs and prevented the situation from becoming a complete catastrophe. But Captain Rodriguez was presenting the mission as if he had been there, as if he understood the split-second decisions that had been made under enemy fire. The team commander made several questionable tactical decisions, Rodriguez continued, and Sarah felt a familiar burning sensation in her chest. She had heard this before, the armchair quarterbacking, the second-guessing by people who had never felt the weight of command in a hostile environment. Admiral Thompson leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin thoughtfully. What's your assessment, Rodriguez?
How do we prevent this kind of failure in the future?
Well, sir, I think we need to look at the command structure. Maybe some of our team leaders aren't quite ready for the level of responsibility we're giving them.
Sometimes you need someone with more gravitas in charge of these operations. Several heads nodded around the table. Commander Briggs chimed in. I agree. These missions require a certain kind of leadership presence. Someone who can command respect from the men in the field. Sarah's pen stopped moving across her notepad. She had been taking notes, documenting the conversation for her own records, but now she found herself gripping the pen tighter than necessary. The someone they were talking about was her. The mission they were dissecting was hers. And the questionable tactical decisions they were critiquing had saved American lives. From what I've read in the reports, Admiral Thompson said, shuffling through a stack of papers, it seems like the team commander got rattled when things went south. Made some panicked decisions instead of sticking to the plan. Sarah's breathing remained steady, her expression unchanged, but inside she was replaying that night in vivid detail. The intelligence had been wrong. The target building had been more heavily defended than expected. When her point man had stepped on an improvised explosive device, she had had exactly 30 seconds to choose between following the original extraction plan, which would have meant leaving him behind, or improvising a new approach that would get everyone out alive. She had chosen her people over the mission objective. She had chosen 3 wounded Americans over a strategic target. And she would make that same choice again, without hesitation. Maybe we need to consider whether some of our commanders are more suited to support roles, Captain Rodriguez suggested, his tone carefully diplomatic but his meaning clear. Not everyone is cut out for the pressure of field command. The room murmured its agreement. Sarah noticed how comfortable they all seemed, how easily they dismissed the life-or-death decision she had made. From their climate-controlled conference room, with their coffee and their PowerPoints, it was easy to second-guess someone who had been dodging bullets and making impossible choices. I've been thinking the same thing, Commander Briggs said, leaning forward with the enthusiasm of someone about to share a particularly insightful observation. Some of these newer commanders, they just don't have the presence, you know. The men need to look at their leader and see someone they can respect, someone who looks like a warrior. Admiral Thompson nodded slowly. There's something to be said for the traditional command presence. These men are putting their lives on the line. They need to have absolute confidence in their leadership. Sarah's eyes moved around the room, taking in each face, memorizing each expression of casual dismissal. None of these men had ever led a team through enemy territory. None of them had ever had to make the choice between completing a mission and saving lives. None of them had ever felt the weight of another person's death on their conscience, or the responsibility of bringing someone else's child home alive. But they all seemed very confident in their opinions about what made a good commander. The real problem, Captain Rodriguez was saying now, warming to his theme, is that we've gotten so focused on political correctness that we've forgotten what actually matters in combat. It's not about checking boxes or meeting quotas, it's about results. And frankly, some people are just better suited to certain roles than others. The conversation continued in this vein for another 20 minutes. Sarah listened to them dissect her mission, her decisions, her leadership, and her competence with the casual authority of people who had never been tested in the way she had been tested every single day for the past 15 years. They talked about the importance of physical presence in leadership, about how troops needed to see strength and authority in their commanders. They discussed the psychological aspects of command, the need for someone who could intimidate enemies and inspire confidence in friendlies. They debated whether certain types of people were naturally better suited for combat leadership roles. Through it all, Sarah sat quietly in her corner, invisible and ignored, listening to a room full of men explain why someone like her couldn't possibly be an effective combat leader. They spoke as if she weren't there, as if their theories about leadership and command were abstract concepts rather than direct commentary on her life and career. Admiral Thompson finally called for a break, and the room erupted in conversation as people stood up, stretched, and headed for the coffee station set up along one wall. Sarah remained in her seat, watching the social dynamics play out. The same men who had been so confidently dismissing her capabilities were now laughing and joking with each other, their earlier seriousness replaced by casual camaraderie. She noticed how they moved through the room, the easy familiarity, the shared references, the unspoken understanding that they all belonged here. This was their world, their club, their space. She was the outsider, the anomaly, the person who didn't quite fit the mold they had created for what a leader should look like. Commander Briggs walked past her chair on his way to the coffee station, and she heard him say to Captain Rodriguez, "You know what the real problem is? We keep putting people in charge who look good on paper but can't hack it when the shooting starts. Give me someone who's been in the trenches, someone who looks like they could kick down a door." Rodriguez laughed. Exactly. These theoretical warriors might sound good in briefings, but when it comes to actual leadership in the field, you need someone with presence, someone the men will follow into hell. Sarah's hands remained folded in her lap, but her mind was working. She was calculating, analyzing, deciding. She had spent her entire career proving herself over and over again, earning respect through competence and courage, only to watch it evaporate the moment she stepped into a room like this. She thought about the three men her questionable tactical decisions had brought home alive. She thought about Master Chief Petty Officer Jackson, who had been her point man on that mission, who had lost his right leg below the knee to that improvised explosive device. She thought about the letter she had written to his wife, trying to explain how her husband had been wounded while serving his country with extraordinary bravery. She thought about Petty Officer Second Class Morrison, who had taken shrapnel in his shoulder and kept fighting until they reached the extraction point. She thought about Hospital Corpsman First Class Chen, who had kept Jackson alive during the firefight while treating his own wounds from the blast. These were her men. These were the people who followed her into hell and back. These were the warriors who knew what real leadership looked like, who understood the difference between talking about courage and demonstrating it. The break stretched on, and Sarah found herself studying each face in the room more carefully. She memorized names, ranks, and the particular ways each man had dismissed her competence. She filed away their comments, their assumptions, their casual certainty that they understood combat leadership better than someone who had actually done it. When Admiral Thompson called the room back to order, Sarah had made her decision. She had spent 15 years being invisible in rooms like this, 15 years listening to people who had never heard a shot fired in anger explain what made a good combat leader. She had earned her place through blood and sacrifice and excellence. But in this room, none of that seemed to matter. It was time to change that. Admiral Thompson shuffled his papers and looked around the room. "All right, gentlemen. Let's continue with our analysis of the Somalia operation. I think we've identified some key areas for improvement in our command structure." Sarah raised her hand. The gesture was so unexpected, so out of place in the flow of the meeting, that several people turned to look at her with surprise. Admiral Thompson paused, his mouth slightly open, as if trying to process why the quiet woman in the corner wanted to speak. "Yes?" he said finally, his tone carrying just a hint of impatience. "Did you have a question about the briefing materials?" Sarah stood up slowly, deliberately. Every eye in the room was on her now, and she could feel the weight of their attention. The mixture of curiosity and mild annoyance that she was interrupting their important discussion. "Actually, sir," she said, her voice calm and clear, "I think there might be some information missing from your analysis." Admiral Thompson frowned. "I'm sorry, miss. Commander Mitchell, sir?" "And I believe I can provide some additional context about the Somalia operation that might be helpful for your review." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sarah could see the confusion on faces around the table, the slow dawning realization that perhaps she wasn't just someone's aide taking notes in the corner, but she was just getting started. The silence that followed Sarah's words stretched like a taut wire across the conference room. Admiral Thompson blinked several times, as if trying to process what he had just heard. Around the table, faces that had been relaxed and confident moments before now showed various degrees of confusion and growing concern. "Commander Mitchell," Admiral Thompson repeated slowly, his eyes scanning the ribbons on her uniform with new attention. "I don't believe I have you on my briefing list for today's meeting." Sarah's smile was polite but carried an edge that hadn't been there before. No, sir, you wouldn't. I wasn't scheduled to brief today. I was invited to observe and provide technical consultation if needed. She paused, letting her words sink in. My specialty is SEAL team operations and post-mission analysis. Captain Rodriguez, who had been so confident in his presentation just minutes before, was now staring at Sarah with the expression of a man who had just realized he might have made a serious error in judgment. His PowerPoint slides were still displayed on the screen behind him, showing his analysis of what had gone wrong in Somalia. Technical consultation, Commander Briggs said carefully, his voice lacking its earlier casual authority. What kind of technical consultation? Sarah moved away from her corner chair, walking slowly toward the front of the room. Her footsteps echoed in the sudden quiet, and every person in the room tracked her movement. There was something different about her now, something that hadn't been visible when she was sitting quietly in the back. Her posture was straighter, her presence somehow larger, more commanding. Well, Commander Briggs, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room, I was asked to review Captain Rodriguez's analysis of the Somalia operation and provide feedback on the tactical decisions made by the team commander. She stopped near the front of the room and turned to face the assembled group. You see, there seems to be some confusion about what actually happened during that mission.
Admiral Thompson was now looking distinctly uncomfortable.
Commander Mitchell, I appreciate your input, but we have a comprehensive after-action report that covers all the relevant details. Do you, sir? Sarah asked, and there was something in her tone that made several people shift in their seats. Because from what I've heard in the last hour, your analysis seems to be based on incomplete information. She moved to stand beside the projection screen where Captain Rodriguez's slides were still displayed. Her eyes swept across the room, making contact with each person who had so confidently dismissed the team commander's performance. For instance, she continued, Captain Rodriguez mentioned that the team commander made questionable tactical decisions when the mission encountered unexpected resistance. He suggested that these decisions showed a lack of judgment under pressure. Sarah's voice remained calm, professional, but there was steel underneath. I'm curious about the basis for that assessment. Captain Rodriguez cleared his throat, his earlier confidence evaporating. Well, according to the reports, the commander deviated from the planned extraction route and, Jane, he trailed off, suddenly uncertain. And? Sarah prompted. And, well, it resulted in delays and additional casualties. Sarah nodded slowly. I see. And tell me, Captain Rodriguez, how many SEAL operations have you personally commanded in hostile territory? The question hung in the air like smoke. Rodriguez's face flushed slightly. That's not really relevant to my ability to analyze tactical decisions, isn't it? Sarah asked, because I'm trying to understand how someone evaluates combat leadership without having experienced combat leadership. She gestured toward the screen. Your slide here suggests that the team commander panicked when the improvised explosive device detonated. Can you walk me through how you determined that panic was the motivating factor rather than, say, tactical adaptation to changing circumstances? The room was dead quiet now. Admiral Thompson was staring at Sarah with growing alarm, as if he was beginning to suspect where this conversation was heading but couldn't quite believe it. Commander Briggs decided to jump in, perhaps thinking he could regain control of the situation. Commander Mitchell, while we appreciate your perspective, I think you might be overcomplicating this. The facts speak for themselves. The mission objectives were not achieved, and American personnel were wounded. That suggests problems with leadership. Sarah turned her attention to Briggs, and her expression was perfectly neutral, perfectly professional, and somehow terrifying. The facts, she repeated. Yes, let's talk about the facts, Commander Briggs. You mentioned earlier that combat troops need to see someone they can respect in their leader, someone who looks like a warrior. I'm curious about your definition of what a warrior looks like. Briggs was trapped and he knew it, but he had committed to his position. Well, it's about presence, about command authority. Soldiers need to have confidence that their leader can handle the pressure. Handle the pressure, Sarah echoed. And how exactly does one determine whether someone can handle pressure? Is it based on appearance, on assumptions about what strength looks like? She began walking around the perimeter of the room, and people's heads turned to follow her movement. There was something predatory about her pace now, something that suggested she was no longer the quiet observer in the corner. Let me share some facts about the Somalia operation that seem to be missing from your analysis, Sarah said. The intelligence was faulty. The target building was not lightly defended as briefed. It contained approximately 30 hostile combatants with military-grade weapons. The improvised explosive device that wounded Master Chief Petty Officer Jackson was one of 6 devices placed along the planned extraction route. Admiral Thompson was now looking genuinely alarmed. Commander Mitchell, how could you possibly know those details? That information is classified above your clearance level. Sarah stopped walking and faced him directly. Is it, sir? Her voice was quiet, but it carried absolute authority. Because I'm having trouble understanding why my clearance level would be insufficient for information about my own mission. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Several people actually recoiled. Captain Rodriguez made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a groan. Commander Briggs went completely pale. Admiral Thompson's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. Your mission? Sarah's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Yes, sir. My mission. I am the team commander whose leadership you've been analyzing for the past hour. Those were my tactical decisions you found so questionable. Those were my men who were wounded under my command. She moved back to the front of the room, and now her presence filled the space in a way it hadn't before. Now they could all see what her SEALs saw when she walked into a briefing room or led them into hostile territory. The quiet woman who had been invisible to them was gone, replaced by someone whose command presence was undeniable. So, let me provide some context that was missing from Captain Rodriguez's excellent analysis, Sarah continued, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made people want to sit up straighter. When Master Chief Jackson stepped on that IED, we were approximately 400 meters from our primary extraction point. The explosion alerted the entire neighborhood to our presence and triggered a coordinated response from enemy forces. She began pacing again, but now it was the controlled movement of a predator, not the quiet shuffle of someone trying to remain invisible. At that moment, I had several options. Option 1, continue to the planned extraction point, leaving Jackson behind because he couldn't move with a severed artery and a shattered leg. Option 2, call for immediate emergency extraction from our current position, which would have meant exposing our helicopter crews to concentrated anti-aircraft fire from prepared positions. Option 3, adapt to the situation and create a new plan that would get everyone home alive. The room was so quiet that the fluorescent lights seemed loud. Several people were staring at their hands, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. Others were looking at her with expressions of growing horror as they realized the magnitude of their mistake.
I chose option 3, Sarah said.
I made the questionable tactical decision to move my wounded team member to a more defensible position while coordinating with air support to create a new extraction point. This required abandoning our primary mission objective, which was the capture of a high-value target. Admiral Thompson was now visibly sweating. Commander, I think there may have been some miscommunication about. Sarah held up one hand, and he stopped talking immediately. The gesture was small, but the authority behind it was absolute. The deviation from our extraction route that Captain Rodriguez found so problematic, she continued, allowed us to avoid 5 additional improvised explosive devices that had been placed along our planned path. The delays he mentioned were the result of my decision to provide medical aid to Jackson, while simultaneously establishing overwatch positions to prevent enemy forces from overrunning our location. She stopped in front of the projection screen and looked directly at Captain Rodriguez. The additional casualties you referenced in your briefing, can you tell me about those? Rodriguez looked like he wanted to disappear. The report mentioned that Petty Officer Second Class Morrison and Hospital Corpsman First Class Chen were wounded during the extraction, Sarah said. What the report might not have mentioned is that both men insisted on staying in the fight despite their injuries. Morrison continued providing cover fire with shrapnel in his shoulder until we reached the extraction point. Chen treated Jackson's injuries while dealing with his own wounds from the blast. She turned to face the room again, and now there was something in her expression that made grown men look away. These are the men whose confidence in leadership you were questioning. These are the warriors who followed me through enemy fire and brought each other home. Morrison earned a Silver Star for his actions that night. Chen received the Navy Cross. And Master Chief Jackson, despite losing his leg below the knee, specifically requested to remain with my team when he returns to active duty. The silence was deafening. Sarah could see the wheels turning in people's minds as they processed what she was telling them, as they realized the full scope of their assumptions and mistakes.
But please don't let me interrupt your analysis,
she said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. I'm sure you have more insights about panic decisions and questionable leadership. After all, you've had the benefit of studying the mission from the comfort of this conference room, with your coffee and your PowerPoints and your theories about what combat leadership should look like. Commander Briggs tried to salvage the situation. Commander Mitchell, we had no way of knowing that you were the team leader in question. If you had realized what, Commander? Sarah asked, cutting him off. If you had realized that the person you were dismissing was actually in the room? If you had realized that your theories about leadership presence and warrior appearance were being heard by someone who had actually led warriors in combat? She paused, letting the question hang in the air. Or would it have made a difference at all? She continued. Because, from what I heard in this room, your analysis wasn't based on the performance of the mission or the outcomes achieved. Your analysis was based on assumptions about what kind of person can be an effective combat leader. And those assumptions seem to be pretty firmly established regardless of actual evidence. Admiral Thompson was now looking genuinely desperate. Commander Mitchell, I assure you that our review process is based entirely on objective analysis of mission performance. Sarah's laugh was cold and sharp. Objective analysis? Admiral, in the past hour I've listened to you discuss the importance of traditional command presence and physical intimidation and leaders who look like warriors. I've heard you suggest that some people are naturally better suited for combat roles and others should be relegated to support positions. Exactly how objective was that analysis? She moved closer to the conference table and several people actually leaned back in their chairs. Let me provide some objective analysis for you, she said. SEAL Team 7 under my command has completed 47 missions with a 100% success rate in terms of primary objectives achieved. We have brought every single team member home alive from every single deployment. Our casualty rate is 60% lower than the average for comparable units, and our mission effectiveness rating is the highest in the teams. Sarah paused to let those numbers sink in. But please tell me more about how I don't have the right kind of presence to lead men in combat. The aftermath of Sarah's revelation settled over the conference room like fallout from an explosion. The men who had been so confident in their analysis just minutes before now sat frozen in various stages of horror, embarrassment, and dawning realization of the career-ending mistake they had just made. Admiral Thompson's face had gone through several color changes, finally settling on an unhealthy shade of gray. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through the papers in front of him, as if hoping to find some document that would explain how this catastrophic misunderstanding had occurred. Captain Rodriguez was staring at his PowerPoint slides with the expression of a man watching his professional life crumble in real time. The slides that had seemed so authoritative 20 minutes ago now looked like amateur analysis by someone playing with concepts he didn't understand. But Sarah wasn't finished. She walked over to the conference table and placed both hands on its surface, leaning forward slightly. The gesture was subtle, but it immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the room. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and absolutely terrifying in its controlled intensity. I want to make sure I understand the situation clearly, she said, her eyes moving from face to face around the table. A group of senior naval officers invited me to a classified briefing where they proceeded to analyze my combat leadership, question my tactical decisions, and suggest that I am fundamentally unsuited for command, all while assuming I wasn't qualified to be part of the conversation. The silence stretched on. No one seemed willing to be the first to respond. Sarah straightened up and began walking around the table, passing behind each chair. As she moved, she continued speaking, and her voice carried the kind of authority that made people want to confess their mistakes without being asked. Admiral Thompson, she said, stopping behind his chair, you suggested that the team commander got rattled and made panic decisions. You implied that this commander lacked the mental toughness required for special operations. Would you like to revise that assessment? Admiral Thompson's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Commander Mitchell, we had no idea. No idea about what, sir? Sarah asked. No idea that I was in the room? Or no idea that your assumptions about combat leadership might be flawed? She moved on to Captain Rodriguez, who was now sweating visibly despite the air conditioning. Captain Rodriguez, you presented an analysis of my mission that concluded I made several critical errors in judgment. You suggested that these errors demonstrated a lack of field experience and tactical knowledge. You also implied that some commanders are better suited to support roles rather than field command. Would you like to explain the methodology you used to reach those conclusions? Rodriguez opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked around the table desperately, as if hoping someone else would rescue him, but every other person in the room was studiously avoiding eye contact. Sarah continued her circuit around the table, and the sound of her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Commander Briggs," she said, stopping beside his chair, "you were particularly eloquent about the importance of command presence and the need for leaders who look like warriors. You suggested that troops need to see strength and authority in their commanders. You also mentioned that some people are naturally better suited for certain roles. I'm curious about your thoughts on what makes someone naturally suited for combat leadership." Briggs was now looking distinctly ill. "Commander, I didn't mean to imply." "What did you mean to imply, Commander?" Sarah asked. Her voice remained perfectly professional, but there was something underneath it that made the question feel like a blade. She had completed her circuit of the table and now stood at the head of the room again. But this time she owned the space completely. Every person in the room was focused on her with the kind of attention usually reserved for natural disasters or incoming artillery. "Because, from where I was sitting," Sarah continued, "it sounded like you were saying that effective combat leadership requires a certain physical appearance, a certain type of presence, and certain inherent characteristics that some people have and others don't. It sounded like you were saying that someone like me, someone who doesn't fit your mental image of what a warrior should look like, couldn't possibly be effective in command." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Was I misunderstanding your position?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Briggs was opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water, but no sound was coming out. Around the table, other faces showed similar expressions of panic and desperate thinking. Sarah decided to help them out. "Let me tell you what I think happened here," she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining a complex tactical situation. "I think a group of senior officers looked at a mission report and made assumptions about what went wrong based not on evidence, but on preconceived notions about leadership and command. I think those assumptions were reinforced by the comfortable certainty that comes from never having to test your theories against reality." She moved to the projection screen and gestured toward Rodriguez's slides. "Captain Rodriguez, your analysis suggested that the team commander panicked under pressure, but you made that determination without speaking to any of the team members who were actually there. Did you interview Master Chief Jackson about his assessment of my performance during the extraction?" Rodriguez shook his head miserably. "Did you speak with Morrison or Chen about their confidence in my leadership during the firefight?" Another head shake. "Did you review the helmet camera footage that shows exactly how each tactical decision was made and executed?" Rodriguez was now looking like he wanted to crawl under the table. "The footage wasn't—" "I didn't have access to." "You didn't have access to the footage, but you felt qualified to analyze the tactical decisions," Sarah said. "Interesting methodology." She turned to Admiral Thompson. "Admiral, you suggested that I lacked the traditional command presence needed for special operations. Can you tell me how you measured command presence? What metrics did you use to evaluate my effectiveness as a leader?" Admiral Thompson was frantically shuffling through his papers again, as if the answer might be hidden somewhere in his briefing materials. "Commander, the assessment was based on..." "On what, sir?" Sarah pressed. "On the fact that I'm 5 feet 4 inches tall? On the fact that I don't have a deep voice or broad shoulders? On the fact that when you looked at me sitting in that corner, you saw someone who couldn't possibly be a Navy SEAL commander?" The accuracy of her assessment hit the room like a physical blow. Several people actually flinched. Sarah walked over to the whiteboard that hung on one wall of the conference room. She picked up a marker and began writing, her movements sharp and precise. "Let me give you some data points for your analysis," she said as she wrote. "SEAL Team 7 mission success rate under my command, 100%. Casualty rate, 60% below average for comparable units. Team retention rate, 90 to 5%. Commendations earned by team members. 47 individual awards for valor. Number of team members lost in action, 0. She turned back to face the room, the marker still in her hand. Training Innovation Implementations, 12 new tactical procedures adopted Navy-wide. Interagency cooperation ratings, highest in Special Operations Community. Mission effectiveness scores, consistently rated exceptional by Joint Chiefs Review Board. She capped the marker and set it down with a sharp click. "But please tell me more about how I lack command presence." The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah could hear the air conditioning cycling on, the distant hum of fluorescent lights, the barely audible sound of people breathing carefully, as if afraid to make noise. Commander Briggs finally found his voice, though it came out cracked and uncertain. Commander Mitchell, we owe you a profound apology. We had no idea. No, Sarah said, cutting him off with a sharpness that made him recoil. You don't get to apologize for not knowing who I was. You need to apologize for the assumptions you made about what effective leadership looks like. You need to apologize for dismissing someone's qualifications based on appearance. You need to apologize for treating combat leadership like an abstract concept you could analyze from the comfort of a conference room. She moved closer to the table again, and this time several people actually pushed their chairs back. Do you understand what you did here today? She asked. You took a mission where 3 American servicemen were wounded, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death, where a team of elite warriors fought their way through enemy territory to bring each other home, and you turned it into an academic exercise about leadership theory. Her voice was rising now, not in volume but in intensity, in the kind of controlled fury that was more terrifying than shouting. You sat in your comfortable chairs with your coffee and your PowerPoints, and you second-guessed decisions made under enemy fire by someone who brought every single one of her people home alive. You questioned the tactical judgment of someone who has never lost a team member, who has never failed a mission, who has earned the respect and loyalty of some of the most elite warriors in the world.
Sarah stopped directly in front of Admiral Thompson's chair and looked down at him.
When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. And the worst part, Admiral, is that you did it all based on assumptions about what a leader should look like rather than evidence of what leadership actually produces. Admiral Thompson seemed to shrink in his chair under her gaze. Commander, I assure you that our intentions were never to. Your intentions don't matter, Sarah said flatly. Your assumptions do. Your biases do. Your casual dismissal of someone's qualifications based on factors that have nothing to do with competence that matters. She straightened up and looked around the room one more time. Every person in this room holds a position of authority in the United States Navy. You make decisions about promotions, about assignments, about who gets opportunities to lead and who gets shuffled into support roles. And if this is how you evaluate leadership, if this is the kind of analysis you bring to those decisions, then we have a much bigger problem than one botched briefing. The weight of that implication settled over the room like a heavy blanket. These weren't just embarrassed officers who had made an awkward mistake. These were senior leaders whose biases and assumptions affected careers, missions, and ultimately the effectiveness of the entire special operations community. Sarah walked back to her original seat in the corner, but she didn't sit down. Instead, she stood behind the chair and looked at the assembled group with an expression that was somehow worse than anger. It was disappointment mixed with professional assessment, as if she were evaluating each of them and finding them lacking. I have one more question for this group, she said, and her voice carried across the room with perfect clarity. How many other qualified officers have you dismissed based on similar assumptions? How many effective leaders have you overlooked because they didn't match your preconceived notions about what strength and competence look like? The question hit the room like a sledgehammer, and Sarah could see the realization dawning on face after face as people began to consider the broader implications of what had just happened. But she still wasn't done with them. Sarah Mitchell stood behind her chair like a general surveying a battlefield where the enemy had just surrendered, but she knew the real work was just beginning. The shocked silence that had fallen over the conference room was not the end of this encounter. It was the moment when consequences would begin to unfold. Admiral Thompson was the first to attempt damage control, his voice carrying the desperate tone of someone who realized his career might be hanging in the balance. Commander Mitchell, I want to assure you that this unfortunate misunderstanding in no way reflects the Navy's official position on diversity and leadership roles. We have always been committed to promoting qualified officers regardless of— Stop, Sarah said quietly, but with such authority that Admiral Thompson's mouth snapped shut immediately. Just stop right there, Admiral. She moved away from her chair and walked to the center of the room, positioning herself where everyone could see her clearly. When she spoke again, her voice carried the kind of controlled intensity that made people lean forward despite their fear. This was not an unfortunate misunderstanding, she said. This was a systematic evaluation of my professional competence based entirely on assumptions about what leadership should look like. You didn't mistake me for someone else. You looked at me and decided I couldn't possibly be the kind of person who could command elite warriors in combat. Admiral Thompson tried to interrupt, but Sarah held up one hand and he fell silent again. And Admiral, if you think this is about diversity or political correctness, you've missed the point entirely. This is about competence. This is about the fact that a room full of senior naval officers just spent an hour analyzing combat leadership. while demonstrating that they have no idea how to recognize it. She began walking around the perimeter of the room again, but this time her movement was different, more purposeful, more predatory. She was no longer the invisible observer, or even the revealed commander. She was something else now, something that made grown men shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Captain Rodriguez," she said, stopping behind his chair, "you presented an analysis of my tactical decisions that was not just wrong, but dangerously wrong. You suggested that adapting to unexpected circumstances showed poor judgment. You implied that saving wounded team members was a failure of leadership priorities. Do you understand how those kinds of assessments affect operational planning?" Rodriguez was sweating openly now. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Commander, I was working with limited information." "You were working with assumptions," Sarah corrected. "And those assumptions led you to conclude that someone who has never lost a team member, never failed a mission, and never received anything less than exceptional performance ratings was somehow unfit for command." She moved on to the next chair, where a colonel from the Joint Operations Office sat looking like he wished he could disappear. "Colonel Martinez, you nodded along when Commander Briggs talked about the importance of traditional command presence. You agreed that troops need to see a certain kind of strength in their leaders. Tell me, Colonel, what do you think my team sees when they look at me?" Martinez opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Sarah waited for a moment, then answered her own question. "They see someone who has led them through 47 successful missions. They see someone who makes decisions based on keeping them alive rather than looking impressive. They see someone who will adapt, improvise, and overcome any obstacle to bring them home. They see someone who has earned their respect through competence, not through conforming to their expectations about what a leader should look like." Sarah's voice was getting sharper, more cutting, as she continued around the room. "But more importantly, they see someone who judges them by their performance, not by whether they fit some preconceived notion about what a SEAL should be. They see someone who promotes based on merit, who gives opportunities based on capability, who builds teams based on effectiveness rather than appearance." She stopped in front of Commander Briggs, who was now visibly trembling. "Commander Briggs, you talked about the psychological aspects of command, about intimidating enemies and inspiring confidence in friendlies. Let me ask you something. Do you think the enemy cares what I look like when my team is conducting a precision assault on their position? Do you think hostile combatants are less likely to surrender because I'm 5'4" tall?" Briggs tried to respond, but Sarah cut him off. "Because I can tell you from experience that the enemy doesn't care about traditional command presence. They care about competence. They care about precision. They care about the fact that when SEAL Team 7 shows up, the mission gets accomplished and American service members go home alive." She moved to the head of the room again and turned to face the assembled group. But now her expression had changed. The controlled anger was still there, but underneath it was something else. A kind of professional disappointment that was somehow more devastating than fury. "Here's what really concerns me," she said, the voice taking on the tone of someone conducting a serious tactical assessment. "Every single person in this room holds significant authority within the special operations community. You make decisions about training, about resource allocation, about personnel assignments. You influence who gets promoted, who gets opportunities, who gets recognized for exceptional performance." She paused, letting that sink in. "And if this is how you analyze leadership, if this is the level of judgment you bring to those decisions, then we have a systemic problem that goes far beyond one embarrassing briefing." Admiral Thompson was now looking genuinely panicked. The implications of what Sarah was saying were starting to register, and he could see his career, his reputation, and his legacy crumbling in real time. "Commander Mitchell," he said desperately, "I assure you that our personnel decisions are based entirely on objective performance metrics." Sarah's laugh was cold and sharp. "Objective performance metrics?" "Admiral, you just spent an hour questioning the performance of someone with the highest mission success rate in the teams because she doesn't look like your mental image of a warrior. Exactly how objective do you think your other evaluations have been?" The question hit the room like a physical blow. Sarah could see people around the table starting to think about their own decisions, their own assumptions, their own potential blind spots. The comfortable certainty they had carried into this room was gone, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that they might have been wrong about more than just this one briefing. "Let me tell you about objectivity," Sarah continued. "Objective evaluation means looking at results, not assumptions. It means measuring performance, not appearance. It means assessing competence, not conformity to expectations." She moved to the whiteboard again and began writing a new list. SEAL Team 7 under my command has completed more successful missions than any comparable unit in the past 5 years. We have the lowest casualty rate, the highest retention rate, and the best interagency cooperation scores in the community. Our training innovations have been adopted Navy-wide, and our operational effectiveness has been recognized by every reviewing authority. She turned back to face the room, marker still in hand. Those are objective metrics. Those are measurable results. Those are the kind of data points that should inform personnel decisions and leadership evaluations. Sarah capped the marker and set it down with deliberate precision. But instead of looking at those results, you looked at me and decided I couldn't possibly be effective because I don't match your preconceived notions about what strength looks like. You dismissed competence in favor of comfort, performance in favor of prejudice. The room was so quiet that the sound of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Sarah could see the weight of realization settling on face after face as people began to understand the full scope of their mistake and its implications. Now, she said, her voice taking on a different tone, still authoritative but somehow more businesslike. We need to discuss what happens next. Admiral Thompson looked up hopefully, as if maybe there was a way to make this all go away quietly. Sarah's next words destroyed that hope completely. Admiral Thompson, as the senior officer present, you're going to need to explain to your superiors how a classified briefing on special operations effectiveness turned into a public demonstration of leadership bias and tactical incompetence. You're going to need to explain how you invited a SEAL commander to observe an analysis of her own mission without knowing who she was. Admiral Thompson's face went grey again. Commander, surely we can handle this internally, can we? Sarah asked. Because this wasn't just an embarrassing mistake, Admiral. This was a demonstration of systematic bias that affects operational effectiveness and personnel decisions throughout the special operations community. She began pacing again, but now her movement had the quality of someone working through a complex tactical problem. Captain Rodriguez, you're going to need to explain to your chain of command how you presented tactical analysis without consulting primary sources, without reviewing available evidence, and without understanding the actual circumstances of the mission you were analyzing. Rodriguez looked like he was going to be sick. Commander Briggs, you're going to need to account for your statements about natural suitability for combat roles and your theories about what makes an effective leader. Those statements were made in an official briefing and reflect your professional judgment about personnel and operational decisions. Sarah stopped pacing and faced the group directly. And all of you are going to need to consider how many other qualified officers you may have overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated based on similar assumptions. How many effective leaders have been passed over because they didn't match your mental image of what competence looks like? How many missions have been compromised because you prioritized appearance over performance? The implications were staggering, and Sarah could see the realization spreading across the room like ripples in a pond. This wasn't just about one briefing or one mistake. It was about a pattern of judgment that could have affected countless careers and operations. There's something else we need to discuss, Sarah said, and her tone suggested that whatever came next was going to be even worse than what had come before. She walked back to her corner chair, but instead of sitting down, she picked up a leather portfolio that had been sitting beside it. She opened it and pulled out a thick stack of documents. Admiral Thompson, you mentioned that this briefing was classified at the highest levels, and that nothing discussed here should leave this room. Admiral Thompson nodded uncertainly, unsure where this was heading. Sarah's smile was sharp and dangerous. Unfortunately for everyone here, that classification doesn't apply to me since I was the mission commander and the subject of your analysis, which means I'm free to discuss this briefing and its contents with anyone I choose. The color drained from every face in the room simultaneously. And I choose to discuss it with some very interesting people. Sarah Mitchell held the stack of documents like a weapon, and every person in the room understood instinctively that their professional lives now hung in the balance. The papers in her hands represented something far more dangerous than career embarrassment. They represented accountability. Let me tell you about these documents, Sarah said, her voice carrying the calm precision of someone who had planned this moment carefully. The top document is a detailed after-action report on the Somalia operation, written by Master Chief Petty Officer Jackson from his hospital bed. In it, he describes in vivid detail how my tactical decisions saved his life and the lives of his teammates. Admiral Thompson's hands were visibly shaking now as he reached for his water glass. The second document is a formal commendation request submitted by Petty Officer Second Class Morrison, recommending me for the Navy Cross based on my leadership during that firefight. Morrison wrote this report while still recovering from shrapnel wounds he received while following my orders. Sarah flipped to the next page in the stack. The third document is a tactical analysis prepared by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, evaluating the Somalia operation as a textbook example of adaptive leadership under extreme circumstances. They're using my decision-making process as a training case study for special operations commanders. She looked up from the papers and let her eyes sweep across the room, making eye contact with each person who had so confidently dismissed her competence just an hour before. And the fourth document, she continued, is a recording authorization form, properly filed and approved, documenting my permission to record this briefing for training and analytical purposes. The silence that followed was not just quiet, it was the kind of absolute stillness that comes when people realize they are witnessing something that will change everything. Captain Rodriguez made a strangled sound. Recording? You recorded this briefing? Sarah's smile was arctic. Captain, when you're invited to observe an analysis of your own combat performance, you take notes. Digital notes. High-definition notes. Notes that capture not just words, but tone, context, and the full scope of professional judgment being displayed. She set the documents down on the table in front of her and pulled out a small digital recording device, placing it next to the papers where everyone could see it. I now have a complete recording of senior naval officers questioning the combat effectiveness of a SEAL commander, based entirely on assumptions about what leadership should look like. I have documentation of systematic bias in operational analysis. I have evidence of personnel evaluation procedures that prioritize appearance over performance. Admiral Thompson tried to stand, but seemed to lose the strength halfway up, sinking back into his chair with a look of absolute defeat. Commander Mitchell, he said weakly, surely we can discuss this situation and reach some kind of understanding. An understanding? Sarah repeated, and there was something in her voice that made several people actually recoil. Admiral, what kind of understanding did you offer me when you were analyzing my fitness for command? What kind of consideration did you show when you were dismissing my tactical decisions? She picked up the recording device and held it where everyone could see it clearly.
Here's my understanding, Admiral. This recording is going to be reviewed by some very important people.
It's going to be analyzed by experts in military leadership, operational effectiveness, and personnel management, and they're going to draw their own conclusions about the quality of judgment displayed in this room. Sarah began walking around the table again, but this time her movement had the quality of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. The first copy is going to Admiral Patricia Hayes, Commander of Naval Special Warfare Command. Admiral Hayes has been working for the past 3 years to improve leadership development and eliminate bias in personnel decisions. She's going to be very interested in this real-world example of how senior officers evaluate combat performance. Admiral Thompson looked like he was having trouble breathing. The second copy is going to General Michael Torres, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Torres has made it his mission to ensure that promotion and assignment decisions throughout the military are based on merit and performance, rather than traditional assumptions about leadership. This recording will provide him with valuable insight into how those assumptions play out in practice. Sarah stopped behind Commander Brigg's chair and he visibly cringed. The third copy is going to Senator Patricia Williams, Chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator Williams has been investigating reports of systematic bias in military personnel decisions. She's been looking for concrete examples of how prejudice affects operational effectiveness and career advancement. This recording should provide her with exactly the kind of evidence she's been seeking. The room had gone beyond silence into something approaching paralysis. Several people looked like they were having difficulty processing what they were hearing. But Sarah wasn't finished. The fourth copy is going to Dr. Angela Rodriguez at the Naval War College. Rodriguez is conducting a comprehensive study on leadership effectiveness in special operations. She's been looking for case studies that demonstrate the disconnect between traditional leadership assumptions and actual combat performance. This briefing should provide her with an excellent example. Sarah completed her circuit around the table and returned to the front of the room, still holding the recording device. And the fifth copy, she said, and her voice took on a tone that suggested this was going to be the worst news yet, is going to the Inspector General's office, along with a formal complaint alleging systematic bias in personnel evaluation procedures within the special operations community. Admiral Thompson made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a groan. The Inspector General has been directed by Congress to investigate reports of discrimination and bias in military leadership development, Sarah continued. They have subpoena power, the authority to compel testimony, and the mandate to recommend disciplinary action against officers whose judgment demonstrates unfitness for command. She paused to let that sink in. They're going to be very interested in this recording, especially the parts where senior officers suggest that some people are naturally better suited for certain roles and others should be relegated to support positions based on factors unrelated to performance. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about embarrassment or career setbacks. This was about formal investigations, congressional oversight, and potential disciplinary action at the highest levels of the Navy. Captain Rodriguez finally found his voice, though it came out cracked and desperate. Commander Mitchell, we made a mistake. We acknowledge that completely. But surely there's a way to handle this that doesn't involve destroying careers over a misunderstanding. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes became even colder. A misunderstanding, Captain? You think this was a misunderstanding? She gestured toward the recording device. Let me play back some of your exact words and see if we can clear up this misunderstanding. She pressed a button on the device, and Captain Rodriguez's voice filled the room, captured with crystal clarity. The real problem is that we've gotten so focused on political correctness that we've forgotten what actually matters in combat. It's not about checking boxes or meeting quotas, it's about results. And frankly, some people are just better suited to certain roles than others. Sarah stopped the playback and looked directly at Rodriguez. Was that a misunderstanding, Captain? Or was that your professional assessment of personnel qualifications? Rodriguez looked like he wanted to disappear. Sarah pressed the button again, and Commander Briggs's voice emerged from the device. These men are putting their lives on the line. They need to have absolute confidence in their leadership. There's something to be said for the traditional command presence. These men need to look at their leader and see someone they can respect. Someone who looks like a warrior. Sarah stopped the playback again and turned to Briggs. Commander, was that a misunderstanding? Or was that your theory about effective combat leadership? Briggs was now openly shaking, but Sarah had saved the worst for last. She pressed the button one more time, and Admiral Thompson's voice filled the room. Maybe we need to consider whether some of our commanders are more suited to support roles. Not everyone is cut out for the pressure of field command. Sometimes you need someone with more gravitas in charge of these operations. Sarah turned off the recording and looked directly at Admiral Thompson. Admiral, was that a misunderstanding? Or was that your assessment of my fitness for command? Admiral Thompson opened his mouth, but no words came out. Sarah picked up her documents and recording device, carefully placing them back in her portfolio. When she spoke again, her voice carried the finality of someone who had made a decision and would not be swayed from it. Gentlemen, you had an opportunity today to demonstrate the kind of leadership judgment that the American people expect from senior naval officers. You had a chance to show that you could evaluate performance objectively, recognize competence regardless of its packaging, and make personnel decisions based on merit rather than assumptions. She closed the portfolio with a sharp snap. Instead, you demonstrated systematic bias, flawed analytical methods, and the kind of prejudice that undermines operational effectiveness and destroys careers. You showed that when faced with evidence of exceptional performance, you were more comfortable believing your assumptions than accepting reality. Sarah moved toward the door, but she stopped before leaving and turned back to face the room one last time. The recording and documentation of this briefing will speak for themselves. The people who review them will draw their own conclusions about the quality of leadership and judgment displayed here today. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. But I want you all to understand something. This isn't about revenge or embarrassment. This is about accountability. This is about ensuring that the next time a qualified officer walks into a room like this, they're judged by their performance, not by whether they match someone's preconceived notions about what competence looks like. Sarah opened the door, and the sound of the hallway beyond seemed unnaturally loud after the suffocating quiet of the conference room. The men and women of the special operations community deserve leaders who recognize excellence regardless of its form. They deserve evaluators who understand the difference between appearance and competence. And they deserve a system that rewards performance rather than prejudice. She stepped toward the door, then paused for one final observation. Admiral Thompson, you were right about one thing. These briefings should remain classified. Unfortunately for everyone in this room, my performance and the systematic bias demonstrated in your analysis of it are matters of significant public interest. Sarah Mitchell walked out of Conference Room C and into the hallway beyond, leaving behind a group of senior naval officers who were just beginning to understand that their comfortable assumptions about leadership, competence, and authority had just been shattered completely. Within 6 months, Admiral Thompson would retire quietly, citing personal reasons.
Captain Rodriguez would be reassigned to a desk job at the Pentagon, where his analytical skills would be applied to logistics rather than personnel evaluation. Commander Briggs would find his promotion prospects permanently stalled, his theories about traditional command presence having been exposed as systematic bias.
But Sarah Mitchell would continue leading SEAL Team 7 with the same quiet competence that had brought 47 missions to successful completion. Her teams would continue to follow her into hostile territory, not because she looked like their mental image of a warrior, but because she had proven herself to be exactly the kind of leader who brought everyone home alive. And in conference rooms throughout the Pentagon and beyond, her story would be told and retold, not as a tale of revenge or embarrassment, but as a reminder that true leadership is measured not by appearance or assumptions, but by results. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of bias, a training case study about the importance of objective evaluation, and ultimately a testament to the power of competence to overcome prejudice. The silence that fell over Conference Room C that day would echo through the halls of Naval Command for years to come, serving as a reminder that sometimes the most important lessons come not from success, but from the moment when comfortable assumptions collide with uncomfortable truths.